been trying to criticize these ideas straightforwardly for some time, and I was being told either that I didn't understand them, or that I just didn't know how the system worked. I had people cloning my family members' social media accounts and messaging me, people trying to find out who I was being funded by via my accountant. I wasn't being funded by anybody. I'm particularly concerned about the illiberal anti-woke backlash that is coming from the right. There's just a kind of counter-authoritarianism that then wants to punish people and cancel them and shut them down and not let them speak. This would actually be good for the white children because it would be a learning opportunity. And they said, take that out because you're centering white people's needs again.
Hello and welcome to Awake at the Wheel. So today we are joined by Helen Pluckrose. Helen is an author, political and cultural commentator, liberal humanist, as well as a political and cultural speaker. She has an academic background in late medieval and early modern women's religious writing and gained notoriety through her work with the Grievance Studies Affair, where Helen and her colleagues purposefully sent shoddy and unethical papers to academic journals that were specializing in identity-based cultural studies. So welcome, Helen.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
So I know my introduction only scratches the surface of the many different works that you've done. So can you tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Yes, well, I entered into that project. I got quite concerned about the use of sort of postmodern derived theories in the field of English literature when I was studying there as a mature student. And at the same time, I'd noted activism that I'd previously been in support of, liberal feminism particularly, was getting very identity focused, intersectional in ways that I didn't think were accurate and that I didn't think were ethical. And so these two things came together. So I started writing about that. I took part in the project to show the problem in academic journals, and I wrote cynical theories, which sort of breaks down the evolution of those thoughts from postmodern ideas into contemporary critical social justice activists. And since 2020, I've been helping individuals and organizations in threat of cancellation with my organization Counterweight. And in my most recent book, how do you push back at this from the inside?
So can you tell our listeners a bit more about what a liberal humanist is, what that paradigm is, and what drew you to that?
Well, in that broadest definition of liberal, I would say, is encapsulated by somebody who believes that we should let other people believe, speak, live as they see fit, provided it does no harm to anybody else nor denies them the same freedom. As a humanist, my worldview is secular, and I am focused on the well-being of humanity, universalism, our shared humanity, and how we can sort of talk to each other across all kinds of identity or political divides.
So on that note, over the time that you've been working in that space, have you seen a shift in this paradigm, specifically with all the changes in politics? And I think what liberal used to mean maybe isn't what it means now. Has that changed the way that you view that paradigm?
Yes, well, I think we've become increasingly illiberal, and this is causing a problem, particularly in countries where the word liberal has come to mean left, obviously, as it has in the US and in Canada, whereas in Australia it now means right. It's associated with conservatism. So this really does get in the way of trying to talk about that very basic sort of freedom orientated philosophy, which underlines the US Constitution in particular, and the development of liberal democracies in sort of the English tradition as well. So I think there's very little point in trying to reclaim words, but with liberalism, there's a whole concept and a cluster of of developing thought over the modern period there. We cannot afford to let our understanding of democratic processes, individual liberty, the importance of viewpoint diversity just kind of disappear. We need words for that. So I'm still trying to get people to accept that liberalism is not a political position on the left or a right, but a philosophical stance about freedom. And this
Absolutely.
has changed. People have become more polarized. There is more left-right sort of opposition going on where people are speaking past each other. But we have the gender critical feminists and the trans activists are a very good example of that. They don't fit neatly into left and right, but they're very much in a polarized position where they're kind of creating narratives about each other, misogynist, transphobe, and we're sort of, and then there's all the liberals in trying to get through saying, but we want people to be able to live as they see fit, but not when it's doing things that harm other people, because biological reality also exists. And people need to be able to say what they actually think. So trying to break through all of this, I think we're entering into a stage where narratives are really sort of defining and dominating the political moment, and trying to break through them, look at points that are being made, arguments as they really are, is getting increasingly difficult.
So, kind of on that same note, I think we can all agree that there's been some positives that have come out of social justice movements, but also there's many of them that have been poorly executed. So, from your view, how can social justice and these shifts that are happening in the political climate and just in the way that we're viewing the world, how can those coexist and kind of translate into positive change with all this divisiveness kind of happening in the background?
Well, I mean, there's certainly a kernel of truth in the critical social justice movement, and that is that culture exists, that it affects the way that we think about things, that having had experience of something may give you a certain perspective on it, which is different to someone who hasn't had experience of it. But these were never denied by anybody in the first place. So I would say that the shift towards the critical social justice movement, which really does sort of deny the objectivity of truth and the idea that we can, as individuals, evaluate ideas for ourselves, decide which we agree with and which we don't, which really holds that we're all socialized into believing certain things, and only this enlightened few, appropriately now mostly named the woke, can see through it and help us all to dismantle our white supremacy, detoxify our masculinity, decolonize our thinking, etc. So I don't really see anything positive there. I do see, of course, that at the end aims to reduce racism, to reduce sexism, to reduce homophobia. Yes, these are very, very good, but these were happening in liberal feminism, in liberal LGBT activism. This was this idea of that sort of comes down to some people are gay, get over it. The colorblindness principle, we don't judge people by the color of their skin. This was making some strides. It was not doing perfectly, and this is why the critical social justice movement arose. After all those big legal changes had been made, they felt, not wrongly, that that's not going to get rid of all kinds of prejudice. We do actually now need to address attitudes. But of course, the way that they have gone at attitudes, by telling other people what they must think because of what their identity is, and how they must dismantle it according to their theories, has been very, very counterproductive. It's caused a great big backlash, not only against the critical social justice theories themselves, but against their causes. So we're now seeing an increase of really misogynistic accounts on social media, sort of outright racism, opposition to support for same-sex marriage has fallen in the US 7% across the board, because that people are backlashing against the groups that these movements claim to speak for, even though I think a majority of all groups never wanted them to and were never represented by it.
So, Oren, did you want to jump in? I have one more question, but it's like probably a lot more detail. So if you want to jump off something with that, go ahead.
Well, just if I want to pick up on one thing Helen said, it's a two-part question. Or it's really one, which is I just heard a libertarian speaking the other day saying it is, as you were saying, it's not about left and right. Okay, it's about liberalism is about freedom versus authoritarianism. right? And I think that people are sort of losing the plot there. They're not realizing that it really is, because as you're saying that, the woke or whatever we want to call them, they're trying to impose a certain system on people rather than trying to find a way to change a system that people will accept or that will work for most people, not just for their standpoint or from their standpoint. So that's a statement. So what I want to ask you was, when you were describing liberal humanism, I just want to ask you, I'm curious, liberal humanism, libertarianism, what would you see as the difference between the two?
I'd say libertarians are probably the most sort of pure form of liberalism. So they are certainly liberals, but they are they tend to have a negative, the negative focus only, with leave other people alone. And they tend to focus a lot on markets as well, and the freedom of markets and that kind of economic liberalism. So they're certainly part of who I'm speaking about with liberals. But as a liberal humanist, I'm sort of more tuned into social issues. We can have liberal leftists as well, who are, and even liberal socialists, who don't agree with the libertarians on economic issues, but are very focused on individual liberty and leaving people alone on that social sphere. And we can have liberal conservatives who are people who are really trying to conserve a lot of the traditions and customs of their country, well, Western civilization, and they're including liberalism among that. So I say that liberal is that broad umbrella, but when we're looking at what is at the root of liberalism, libertarians are at that root.
Okay, thanks. I just thought I wanted to clarify that. Okay. Sorry, Malcolm.
Yes, it's very difficult with the terminology, and then people sort of misunderstanding me because I haven't set out what I'm talking about with liberalism.
So I think you've painted a pretty clear picture as far as like what likely inspired the Grievance Studies project that you worked on. But how did you guys come up with that idea? I read about this in a little bit more detail the other day, and I was just so fascinated by like what sparked that.
Well, my motivations for joining it was that I'd been trying to criticize these ideas straightforwardly for some time, and I was being told either that I didn't understand them, or or that I just didn't know how the system worked, and I really wanted to get in there. I wanted to show that I do understand how the theories work. I wanted to get them published in the journals that were publishing them. I mean, particularly Hypatia, the leading feminist journal, is where a lot of this is coming from. And we got one accepted and one was under revise and resubmit when we got found out. So just kind of getting into that system, seeing how it worked, and then being able to bring everything together so that the best source of our papers now is that all of our citations are absolutely accurate and they're cited in context. So if anybody wants to go and look at a school of thought around something like epistemic justice, you can go to one of our papers and you can find a summary essentially of the worst ideas we could find in there and the sources for that. So that this now makes it harder, I think, for people to say that I just don't understand what the theories are saying. And then I can hopefully, and we can just kind of show, because people were also saying, well, this is just a few fringe lunatics. It's just there's always some mad papers getting published, but I think we need to show the volume of it, and also show how we were directed when we wrote anything to them at all to bias our things more in this direction. Sometimes when we thought we'd gone too far and they couldn't possibly accept this. So, for example, when we worried a bit about advocating putting white kids on the floor in chains as a form of existential reparations, we thought, well, nobody's going to accept that. So we made an argument saying that this would actually be good for the white children because it would be a learning opportunity. And they said, take that out because you're centering white people's needs again. So
Come
they didn't need.
Oh my gosh.
So I have to ask, because I mean, that's when you first burst on the scene with Peter and James, and it was, you guys did the rounds, and it was quite shocking. And then there was the backlash, and it's so hard today, where everyone seems to be watching the same screen, two different movies. Some people are saying this, this exposed academia and the rot, or whether it's about feminism or about, whatever narrower field. And others said, no, this was overstated. It was overblown. They were rejected from these journals, and, that their claims are overstated, basically. So, it's been a few years now. So looking back, where would you say, like, what would, where would you place your great hoax, the three of you, and what actually did happen, and what is the impact, and has there been any positive change, would you say, based on what you guys exposed?
Well, I'm not sure. I think that there has been some positive change. People are now more willing to accept what will get published in these areas, and they are more likely to see it as a problem. I was trying to really convince the liberal leftists who weren't into critical social justice ideas themselves, but generally thought it to be a more benign thing than it really was. So I think we did make some headway there. But I would say our project isn't best understood as a hoax, because we were producing the kinds of papers that were already getting published. So the journals weren't tricked into accepting them. We were just exploring the system and seeing how it worked themselves personally. So we described it as a kind of reflexive ethnography, essentially. We wanted to go in there, we wanted to try and give them what they wanted, have them tell us what they wanted, see how it works. So I would say it was an exploratory thing. Big claims have been made for it, which shouldn't have been. People have said that we've undermined the whole sort of concept of peer review. That isn't true. Peer review is as good as the reviewers are. Now, if you look at what the criteria these reviewers were going on, I would say that this is bad for academic standards. But that's an argument that I make. I'm showing what is there. So a lot of people did say, yes, well, these were just bad journals. And well, in that case, please discredit everything else that has come out of these journals, because that's where most of it is coming from. And other people were saying, well, actually, these papers were good, but you put in some false data. All of our data should have been recognized as highly implausible, and we also didn't read it correctly. And so you've just kind of tricked them into accepting it, so it doesn't count for anything. Well, it does, because we're copying what is already there. So and all of our citations are accurate. So I would say that people should not read. We have not demolished academia or the study of women's rights or anything else along those lines, and that's what we put in our our sort of breakdown of it. Don't read too much into this. A lot of the scholarship that is out there is still very good. This kind isn't, and we're setting out why we don't think this particular type of theory is. And you should be concerned that we managed to get 7 papers accepted, and particularly that it only took an average of 2 weeks to write these papers, because I'm just sort of getting these ideas, recycling them, and then putting them in another context, and churning them out again. And this isn't academic scholarship. You shouldn't be able to do that. So we really just wanted to see that this was a problem. Having 7 of them accepted and 7 under revise and resubmit, with 5 of them with a very good chance of being accepted in the very near future, this is a problem, and it's not the only problem that exists. There are other problems in psychology, in science, in other fields, and people have to address those problems all the time. So that was what I put the limitations on that.
Okay. And for you, if I can ask, like, afterwards, because again, I followed the story in the media, but for you personally, in the years following that, I know that you were an editor-in-chief at Aereo magazine, which had some amazing, like, I was reading those articles at first, like, very long form, not your typical, 140 or 280 characters. It was in, deep dives and some just heterodox thinking, and just some, like, it really opened my eyes to a lot of different concepts. So I know you were editor-in-chief for a while, and you have the other program, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on it, that you stopped last year, a couple of years ago. Sorry?
Counterweight?
Counterweight, thank you. That's the word, yes. So that's professionally, let's say, but personally, what has, being sort of thrust on the stage like this, on the grand stage, what has that done for you personally? And how does it change your perspective on life and, as human?
Yeah, so I'm very very much much more of a private person, really. When I entered in on the Grievance Studies Affair, the understanding was that the other two would do the public things. I would be in the background writing and researching and checking things theoretically. And then I came, after it came out, a lot of people wanted to speak to me, particularly. And I think this was because a lot of it was critical of feminism. And a lot of people doing interviews and podcasts didn't want to have two straight white men talking about it. If there was a woman available to say, I do consider myself a feminist, I am critical of this kind of feminism. So I started to speak more then. And then I found that I was getting more comfortable with public speaking, but I still prefer really to be a writer or do sort of smaller, not small but quiet podcasts, not sort of big public events or Joe Rogan or something. I let the other two go on that because that was just a little bit. 3 hours was a bit much. So it was stressful to do that, and a lot of there was a lot of very personalised and targeted abuse. I had two people who seemed to make it their full-time job to interrogate absolutely everything I said, twist it, misrepresent it. I had people cloning my family members' social media accounts and messaging me. I had people trying to find out who I was being funded by via my accountant and my bank. I wasn't being funded by anybody, and it did get really very, very nasty. A lot of the stalking. I did talk to the police at one point, but it seemed clear that the two sort of main stalkers I had were in the US, which is not anything they can do anything about. I gathered this from the spelling, and so there. I don't think there was only one that was considered a credible threat, and he was in the UK, and they were already on him, and he was targeting other people more. So that was quite difficult. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. It's so ridiculous. So
Yeah.
imagine I had each of those, let's say the primary people who were either stalking or targeting, or, made it their life's mission to make your life miserable. If they came to therapy and I had them lying on my couch, okay, and I'm asking them deep down, okay, and they're being as honest as possible. What is your motive? Why are you going after her? Would they all have the same one? Would there be 5 different ones? Like, what do you think?
I think because there was one individual who he wasn't. I don't think he was involved in trying to sort of clone my family members' accounts or anything like that. But he was particularly sort of targeting us, and I did address him publicly because he was making accusations of sexual misconduct for some of my male colleagues, and they weren't true. So I did speak to him publicly about his stalking of one of my colleagues, and he actually said at that point, well, if he wasn't going on about gender studies like this, if he wasn't attacking gender studies, I wouldn't have to make this stuff up. And I thought, good. And that was then seen publicly that he had said this, and we were able to keep that as evidence, and it did damage his reputation. So I won't mention his name and damage it any further. But that I think encapsulated it. Essentially, this is the ends justify the means. Because we criticise these particular theories, we are therefore the enemies of racial equality, sex equality, the freedom to sort of be attracted to people of the same sex and have relationships. So we're just generally very bad sort of reactionary right-wing people who are trying to hurt marginalised, vulnerable people. Therefore, we are in a war, and it is acceptable to attack us in any way that is likely to work, and that includes character assassinations, misrepresentations, and really trying to mess up our lives.
Right. And again, that goes back to what we were saying about liberalism truly is about freedom versus authoritarianism or tyranny. When people are portraying you this way. And as you say, the ends justify the means, because you must be such terrible people. Therefore, you must be stopped by any means necessary. I mean, people just lose sight of. I mean, they can't see the hypocrisy. I've said this so many times. The people who claim to be the most compassionate, the most empathetic, the most humanistic are sometimes some of they evince some of the worst qualities and behaviors you can imagine, and they don't see it. They truly don't see it, because they have portrayed themselves as the hero. They are going to conquer the villain. So how did it feel being the public villain? Not. And I'm wondering whether the people who knew you, whether they started drifting away and saying, we don't want to catch the shrapnel, or if they truly believed that you were a terrible person, or if they said, these people have no idea what they're talking about, we stand by you. What would you say was the overall effect personally?
Well, I think because I'm kind of quite a reclusive person, I really have a few sort of solid friends and connections that I feel closely connected to, and the people, those people stood by me, and they told people that this was nonsense. This wasn't who I was. I felt very supported by my by the people I'd chosen to be connected with. Of course, on the broader scale, there was a lot of a lot of nastiness coming from, I think, my university. For example, I don't think it likes me very much anymore, and the professors that are there, whom I had liked and that I had worked with, I don't think they do either. So there's something there, but mostly the nastiness was coming from the worst of it was the people who are really very rhetorically skilled and who can engage in a great deal of sophistry, and who can take something that is almost my point and then twist it to being something which is so totally opposed to my point that I then have to, I feel I have to untangle it and so, no, this is not what I said, and you can see this quite clearly. And then they would twist something else, and I would come back and I would do that again. And this was what caused me to have a nervous breakdown in the end, and see a clinical psychologist myself. And we were working together on these people's perception and creation of a version of you cannot actually affect who you really are. I was feeling almost like these versions of me that were being created could have some ability to taint me. And you have to sort of have a strong sense of yourself. You know that you don't believe these things. You know that these aren't your motivations. Trying to learn to shrug off people who clearly aren't arguing in good faith, to trust that people who are paying attention will know what my views really are, and not almost like an OCD response. I think it was as though if I set my ideas out carefully, it's like I've arranged ornaments on a shelf, and then someone comes in and messes them all up, and I feel like I have to jump up and put them straight again, and then they come in and they mess it up again, and I feel like I can't rest until I get absolutely exhausted. And the idea of because I was treated for OCD in my 20s, so kind of using the same techniques there is a kind of acceptance. These people have said this. I'm not going to react to it. I'm going to observe that they've done that, observe that they're wrong. I'm going to let it go. The anxiety will come down again. So that was quite a good technique there for dealing with that, for not feeling like I have to tidy messes that are being made of my ideas and my character all the time.
And how terrible. I mean, this is one of the many drawbacks, I guess, of online interactions. While it's great that we can have a farther reach with all these online platforms, I think what's lost in that is people forget that they're targeting real human beings who have real consequences like you did. I'm so sorry to hear that that's how severely it impacted you. But at the same time, I'm not surprised, unfortunately, because like you said, these were character assassinations and complete misrepresentations of who you are and what your intentions were.
I think some people did recognize this because I disappeared entirely for 9 months. I got rid of all my social media accounts. I got a job in social care where I work, and I wasn't intending to come back. When I eventually did, because I found my urge to opinionate becoming too strong again, I did get some positive. So one academic who really had been quite nasty and dishonest, sort of commented to say that she was glad that I was back and that I was feeling better, and she toned herself down then. And one particular stalker who really had been quite unhinged wrote me a public apology saying that she had been mentally unwell at that time, and she'd attacked me and really made my life very difficult, and she regretted it. So I thought, okay, so there are people there who can see that the people they're attacking are humans and may not be evil. But it did build up again. But fortunately, my Twitter account, which had 90,000 followers at the time, had died. And I've not let it get too big again because I know that I don't want to be in. And I also, my friend manages the account for me now because it's just very, very difficult not to keep correcting false accusations, I find. Other people seem to get off very, very well. I don't find that's so easy for me.
Yeah, and that's kind of what my next question was, is what do you think you could have done differently, or is there anything you could have done differently looking back on the situation?
I think I could have got some support a bit earlier, recognized that I was getting sucked into pointless arguments and with people who weren't speaking in good faith, and felt more confident in myself, which I can see for other people. I would say to other people who are going through this, I'll just drop them a note saying that all of us who are honest and actually paying attention can see what you're actually saying. The people who are claiming that you are a white supremacist, patriarchal imperialist or whatever are not responding to anything you've said, and we can see this. Don't feel as though you have to keep justifying yourself, to keep correcting, because you will burn yourself out. We see it, you know.
Yeah.
So a couple of things. Yeah, what you were saying earlier, I say this with many patients, different variations, but I say, like, you don't let either this person or in general other people's neuroses or projections of their own insecurities or bigotry or whatever define you. Okay, and that's sort of what you came to have to come to terms with. Basically, I can't let them define my reality, right? Because right, especially when A, it's distorted, and B, it's not coming from good faith, right? So that's an important, that's for anybody. I think it's so important for people to to try to really grasp. Easier said than done, of course, but that's what we aim for. And then second, just maybe we can talk about what you are doing now professionally or behind the scenes, or trying to sort of promote the same type of, let's say, philosophy or ideals that you were trying to do before. And then third, just tied to that, because I don't want to forget it. I know that you work toward trying to help people, let's say, see other people's perspectives, like how to encourage dialogue when two people are very diametrically opposed to certain topics. If we can sort of just touch upon all those. I threw them out, setting the agenda there, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I'm mostly now writing on Substack. I'm particularly concerned about the illiberal anti-woke backlash that is coming from the right. So I've been addressing that as well, because as somebody who I think could rightly be described as anti-woke, I think there are ethical and honest ways to do this, and then there's just a kind of counter-authoritarianism that then wants to punish people and cancel them and shut them down and not let them speak, and is really very irrational. So I'm trying to, at the moment, get people who are anti-woke to make sure that they maintain their principles, remember those good arguments that they made against cancellation, against censorship, when it was coming from the woke, and oppose people who are trying to do that too. The people who could be considered woke, or people who are on the left, or even people who are just women or black or gay, because that's what's worrying me, and that's what's always worried me, that there would be an illiberal anti-woke backlash, and that it would set back advances that we had made, and I think that has happened. So I'm addressing that. I'm still working with organisations who are having a problem with authoritarian critical social justice or woke activism in their midst, and I'm trying to prioritise the sort of medical, social, and humanitarian and charitable fields with doing that. They've had a particular problem. A lot of very well-intentioned people have taken on critical social justice ideas, and it tends to then paralyse the organisations. So I'm working with three big organizations now, one in the field of clinical psychology, one in humanitarian aid, and one in effective communications, to try and sort of roll this back in their organization so it doesn't get bogged down with it and stop being effective. So that's, I think, very important.
Okay. And this sort of ties to then my other question, which is, let's say when you go into these organizations, and I'm not sure if you can specify, because you said clinical psychology, that piqued an interest, of course. I'm wondering, because I've had so many people ask me, like, what do we do about this? And, Mal and I have talked about this all the time, like, how do we make change? So for you, you go in there, is it education? Is it like, how do you facilitate that kind of change that needs to happen?
Well, the thing that I've been helping with clinical psychologists, this particular group with, is a kind of assault from Indigenous knowledge. So this has been coming in a claim that clinical psychology, being focused on evidence-based outcomes, empirical research, scientific practitioners, as they say, it is a Western white masculinist approach to psychology, and instead we need we need to decolonize that, get Indigenous ways of knowing in there. And so my psychologists are arguing that no, people, you can have a great deal of respect for other cultures you can enjoy, and these sort of cultural artifacts, but when it comes to patient or client outcomes, then you really need to go with evidence-based research. So they are making good arguments from that perspective, and they're getting quite a lot of support, particularly because there are Indigenous psychologists among them saying that this is not this is not what they find to be helpful. So we're hoping that will. Well, it seems to be. So what was happening at the moment was that we thought that that this group was just going to be squashed out of existence, but now communications are happening. Some other sort of senior members of the profession are backing it, and so we're really very hopeful there's going to be a tide turning there.
I'm really fascinated by that, and perhaps this is a question for another day, but what do you think is fueling that push? I mean, I'm not surprised to hear that, because I think to some extent there's some of that happening here where we practice. But why dismantle something that our profession has worked so long to gain credibility and have all of these really strong evidence-based methods and strategies that work for people?
Mm. I think it is because of the postmodern basis that is underlying this, and the power that a few activists can have, because the beliefs are that knowledge is a construct of power. The powerful get to decide what is true, and then they develop ways of talking about things which convinces everybody else that it's true, and then we need to deconstruct and dismantle this. And a way of doing that is other ways of knowing, which include the lived experience of minority groups, and it also includes Indigenous and sort of post-colonial subjects. Their approach to things, and there's something very well intentioned in there, but it does also recreate colonialist narratives, because what we're seeing across STEM is this: we had this colonialist idea that the white Western society was rational and scientific and liberal, and then it needed to colonize everywhere else for its own good. Because it was irrational and superstitious and myth-based. And then we had a kind of rise of liberalism, which held, well, no, everybody, science can be used by everybody. It has been historically, it still is being. People can be anti-scientific, irrational as well in white Western civilizations, and they certainly are. So, and it works wherever you are. This is the good thing about the scientific approach. It doesn't care what your identity is. The same principles are going to be there. And then when the sort of critical social justice approach rose, then it went back to the colonialist thing, except instead of saying we are rational and liberal and scientific and that is good, it was we are rational and liberal and scientific and that is bad, because we have oppressed these other groups here. So there's a kind of post-colonial guilt, or a settler colonial guilt, depending what country you're in and what context you're in, that is at play here. And so there are very sort of well-intentioned people, and I think a lot of progressives do sort of gravitate towards the talking professions. And so once a few activists get in there and they start making these claims, then it becomes very difficult for the general body of psychologists or scientists of any kind to say, well, I don't think that's a good idea. I think that sort of scientific and empirical research is successful because it works, and we really need to focus on what works, because then they fear that they will be seen as being racist, as having an imperialist attitude. So what I'm trying to help people to do when they're coming up against this is to show that they are actually opposing a colonialist narrative. They are making, say, Indigenous or previously colonized people these they have this particular kind of knowledge. It's very surprising, for example, to a lot of Indian Brits who have come over and are 4 times more likely to be medical doctors than the rest of the population, to be told that Western science and medicine is not for them, and they have a completely different way of knowing. It's insulting, and it's colonialists with that attitude that we have this way of knowing, you have this other way. So by kind of giving people ways to speak about this, to defend science and empirical research, and to see people as individuals who can choose to use scientific and evidence-based epistemologies or not to, and that this is not geographically specific, then they feel more confident that they can make a case for this, which sounds principled, which sounds knowledgeable, which is less likely to be mistaken for racism.
Yeah. And it's so odd to me. And I always tiptoe around things like this because I'm always shocked to learn like these huge shifts. I've been a psychotherapist for a decade now. And in that decade, I've seen, so my training was, have cultural competency, understand people's lived experiences, view things through that lens, but also be scientific about what we're doing. And then I'm hearing you say this, and to be honest, I had no idea that this was the shift. And Oren, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if it's quite to that extent here, but I'm flabbergasted to hear what you're describing here.
Yeah, well, I've got to be careful just because of things that have been happening. But there has been, at least in academia as well, a shift to trying to, again, let's say, promote Indigenous ways of knowing and trying to replace. It's not sort of incorporating and having a space for it. It's replacing for all the reasons that Helen said. So there is that shift, at least in academia. I'm seeing that, and I haven't seen it as much in the in the psychology field. But everything that Helen said about like the intent of recognizing how colonialist and patriarchal and everything that we are, that of course has permeated our professions. So I've got to ask you, Helen. So this again goes back to my previous question, which is, well, actually 2 things. One, we had someone on early the other week, a journalist, Barbara Kay, and I used the word cowardice. I talked about the cowardice of people in charge who allowed this to happen. Okay. And she didn't like that word because she thought, they have professions, they have careers, they have families they have to raise. If they see this wave coming and they're sort of hunkering down, like they're not trying to be a bulwark against it. They're just allowing it to happen because, they don't want to be, I guess, swept away or, devastated by it. And so she didn't quite see it as cowardice. Point taken. I appreciate that. I still do, quite frankly. When you have people like that in charge, whether it's cowardice or simply just wanting to keep their jobs or keep the status quo or whatever, how do you break through? It's not just with evidence. You were talking about a strategy. You were talking about framing, I guess. Does it really boil down to a kind of framing that they can't assail, or how do you penetrate?
Yeah, well, that's what I got at in my last book, because that's a very practical guide. And the counterweight handbook is called Principled Strategies, and this is what we do. So it depends on what I do when I help somebody or an organization, is look at what is happening in the management, in the HR department. So that if you can get different, if you've got true believers in there who really want to revolutionize everything, then you're in a very difficult situation. There are certain things that you need to do. Then you need to sort of monitor what's going on very carefully there. You need to relate it to the laws of employment in your country, so that you can can see you can make complaints go over their heads if need be, but it's really very difficult. But often what you have instead is what I've called the buzzword waffler. And these are people who don't entirely buy into this. They may not even know what it is exactly, but they have to tick certain boxes. And activists are making it very difficult for them. They are making a nuisance of themselves. So what I am helping people to do is make a nuisance of themselves, because this is this is the way to go when you have somebody who is doing this because they want a quiet life, is to be politely, patiently persistent in pointing out the flaws with everything, writing sort of notes, letters to them in a group, ideally asking for meetings. I always advise letters if possible, because or if you have to have a meeting, then write it up afterwards and send it in. So there's a record of that, and essentially making it so that the your manager or your HR people will back down, because it is actually too much trouble for them now. And of course, this varies according to country. In the US, we have the biggest problem because there are no cause firing laws. The UK has some protection of philosophical beliefs that people can lean on. Canada, I believe, has protects religious beliefs, and philosophical beliefs vary from region to region, province to province. So we have to kind of look into what is going there, but trying to make a nuisance of yourself in a very polite, principled, and knowledgeable way is the best thing for getting these people who aren't completely committed to back away from what they were saying. I mean, in one particularly ridiculous situation, we had an employee tell his HR people that Robin DiAngelo, who they were advocating, had said that all white people were racist, and he thought that was racist, and that went against the policies of the company, and that Kendi, Ibram X. Kendi, had said that there is no such thing as non-racist, you're either racist or anti-racist. And they came back to him saying, oh, these are right-wing speaking points, they don't say anything of the kind. And he then sent them evidence of them saying precisely that. And it was, again, he was told that this was just right-wing speaking points, that wasn't what was happening. So we had to push very persistently to say, no, look, here it is. This is what they're saying. Here are other organizations saying what they are saying. You are putting this in there, and I want to know, do I have the right not to believe this? And particularly when depending on what kind of rights you have, nearly everywhere protects religious freedoms, for example. So the idea that everybody is unavoidably socialized into white supremacist beliefs can be countered quite effectively by pointing out that this requires people to deny the beliefs in all three of the Abrahamic religions in God-given free will, that you can evaluate things yourself, you can reject sin, you believe racism is a sin, you reject that. So it is really a very strategic approach, knowing what kind of problem you've got, whether it is a true believer or a box ticker, and then what is the best way to get around that. So that's what we learn over sort of 2-year baptism of fire, really, because Counterweight started up right at the height of the Black Lives Matter protests, and we're getting hundreds of people, and we just kind of poured them into a Discord server and just kind of to triage as much as we could. So we'd kind of developed letters and strategies that work now, and that's very. So not very concise here, but that's not very satisfying to some people who want to see a big fight and a defeat. But quite often, I mean, what I'm doing most of the time is helping people pull their organisation back from the brink, and get the workplace culture to be more inclusive of diverse viewpoints using communication, and that really is very effective. But it's not so satisfying for people who really want a big clash and for the woke to be defeated and fired and vilified, you know?
And I think you've answered my question. So with this podcast, we always try to summarize with what can people do on an individual level regarding these problems. So I think what you're saying is, have some degree of impact within the organizations that they work within. What else would you say people can do on an individual level to make an impact?
I think have a good understanding of what kind of problem you have. A lot of times people react to words like diversity, equity, and inclusion, but a lot of organizations now are still using these terms, but in a much more genuinely inclusive of diverse viewpoints way. So make sure you read everything and that you're not reacting to a discourse rather than what's actually there. Then take the minimum force approach. If you see a problem arising, be very, very firm, very clear, put things in writing, have a strong sense of what your own principles are. Why do you think this is wrong? So if you're asked to be affirm that say you are racist because you are white, then you might think, well, no, I believe that I can evaluate and reject racist ideas, and I think I have a moral responsibility to do that. I don't accept that. So when you've got that idea, then you can respond on that level. Above all, what I would recommend people to do is not fall into the trap of arguing within the economy of the critical social justice activists. It's much like if somebody is saying to you at work, you can't be gay because the Bible says it's a sin, then you have the right to, you wouldn't then argue, well, the Bible doesn't actually say this. In other parts with Jonathan and David, it seems like it's quite acceptable. You can just say, I am not a Christian and I don't have to be. And that's what I would advise people to do in a workplace when they come up against this. Don't try and sort of, well, no, not all white people aren't racist, and some people don't believe in gender identity, and that's not transphobic. Instead, just say, I understand that you hold these beliefs, and I would want you to be able to do that. I hold different beliefs. I oppose racism, sexism, homophobia, discrimination from a different philosophical standpoint. How can we work together without either of us trying to impose our ideas on each other? In this way, you're then forcing your manager or whoever at the top to either say, okay, you can have your own ideas and we can work together, or literally say to you, well, you can't. You can't hold your liberal, conservative, libertarian, Christian, Jewish, whatever idea. You can't hold them. You have to believe in this one thing. And once they have said that, then you have courts making a legal argument. But I find in most cases they draw shy of saying that, and you can often make people realize that they are trying to make you pretend to believe something you don't by putting them in that position. And then they back off.
Yeah, and it's essentially a respectfully agree to disagree with a strategy behind it that if they respond in a certain way, they could get themselves into some trouble.
Yes.
So, and this is something, whether it's about these issues or about something entirely different. I've worked with so many people in, let's say, either broken organizations, corrupt or toxic, however you want to phrase it, where I always say to them, if you are going to try to advocate for yourself, the number one thing, there's a few things I say, but you have to be prepared to keep going higher. Like, you can't stop at this level. You have to be prepared to go not to war to destroy, but to war to save yourself, basically. Like, because people live in these little fiefdoms and they believe that if they are in charge and there's, they may know there are people on top of them, but they think that there's a layer that prevents the others from above from seeing. So I always say we're trying to poke holes, and the only way to do that is to either circumvent or to escalate, through the procedures that are available in your organization. So I've said that to many people. Some people do follow through, and they do keep going higher and higher, and they do find that there is recourse because, again, they're not backing down in the way that you say. So I'm wondering whether you, with the people that you've worked with, it's not just putting the words on the paper. It's encouraging, it's motivating, it's inspiring them to have the courage to actually take those steps. Have you found that there's something specific, whether it's an approach or a framing or something that can actually get those people to take that? Or is it simply that some people are able to do it and others just don't have the wherewithal and gumption to do it?
I think so. Yes. I mean, one of the strategies that I've set out, it looks at how it encourages people to look at the ways in which they can push back. So, how secure is their job, and what kind of personality do they have? And so then I would argue that because we've had these approaches which are a stealth, gentle, firm and hard and public, how you're going to go at this and where you are. So I would say if you are, say, a tenured professor, then you have some security here. And I would then urge them to use that for to stand up for this for your junior colleagues. But if it's somebody in particular, it has been students, master's students, particularly in psychology and social work and these fields and teaching, that I have to say that have the stealth approach here, because it is much better for your field if you don't get kicked out of your course of study before you qualify. So in these cases, I then sort of help people to see how they can try not to contribute to the environment, but they can get through their course of study, they can qualify, and then once they are there, they can make a difference. They can start pushing it back. So I think I don't try to inspire people to go in harder than they would otherwise do if they are really, they certainly want to. They see the problem. I help them to feel more confident they are right in seeing that problem and to feel more confident of their ability to push back at it. But I would be wary myself of saying to somebody, well, you need to be braver. You need to get out there. I mean, is verbal argumentation for a lot of people, particularly I found in the emergency services, they tended to react quite angrily, but they had a more sort of blunt and proactive psychology, which I think you probably need to do if you're going to go into the fire service or the police or something in that area. And this often led to quite intemperate speech. And so I'd say if you are not naturally a diplomatic person who is good at sort of making these kind of arguments and keeping your cool, put things in writing, do it in a group, whatever. You have to sort of work out what is best for you, as well as for works with your personality and your skills, as well as what will work. That's a very long-winded answer.
No, it's great. I mean, and we're going to put your their books and everything in the description so people can see that, because I mean, a lot of what you're saying is captured in, especially in the last book. So, so I'm going to ask you one last thing. Sorry, Ali, if I can just ask.
I'll try to be briefer.
Well, here is the sad thing is, whatever the profession is, many of my patients, even in the field of teaching or of medicine or anywhere else, they know for a fact that even once they get into the field, even once they've got the credentials, there really isn't much that they can do. If they speak out, they're never going to be hired for this position. They're never going to be given a promotion. They can't get a job or so on. So to the people who truly are going to have to be working in an environment or in a field that they don't agree with the ideologies, and they're seeing it, and there's literally nothing they can truly do because they just don't have that impact. No matter what they do, it's not going to change anything. What would you say to someone to help them sort of come to terms with that?
I would say that there is always something you can do. It can be very, very difficult to see it, but the options aren't sort of keep your head down and go along with it, or throw yourselves on the grenade. So for one client, it was an absolutely brilliant thing. So I always give her as an example. She was dealing with sort of post-colonial theory in her workplace, and she was quite a non-confrontational person, and she did not feel she could speak up at all, and she probably couldn't. But what she came to me, she said, I've just been using this language of decolonize, and I don't believe this. What am I saying? And so she then started not to use this language herself, not to contribute to the pressure for preference falsification. She started then, when she was speaking, to use language a little bit more of a viewpoint diversity, only the tiniest bit. And then another colleague came and sounded her out very carefully, and they kind of danced around each other for a while. And then they found that they were both on the same page. And then together they found some other people, and they found that the number of people in their organization who were genuinely committed to this were much lower than they thought it was, and they did manage to make a substantial change to the workplace environment. So I would say, don't feel at the very least, don't contribute to the environment. If you feel like you can't speak up at all, at least try not to speak into it. and give other people the impression. Have a look around to see if there are other people there who seem to be uncomfortable. Get some. I've written more about this, but to get other ideas in there, just to at least start to sort of circulate some of these ideas about being able to think for yourself, appreciating people with different philosophical and cultural and religious and political worldviews, and try just these little sort of tests, and you may well find that that there are more people who will support you, and you can make a difference. If you really can't, if you're in a totally critical social justice dominated environment, I would just advise to get out, really, because we've seen so many people have complete breakdowns and really not be able to function. So if it starts eating into your life and destroying you, just try and find another job.
I like your approach, though. I think that it's anchored in respect, and that's kind of been the theme throughout a lot of the ways you've approached things and that you're recommending others approach things is start with respect. And I think that we can get a lot farther that way than being combative right off the bat.
Relentlessly assume that whoever you're talking to will not want to deny your freedom of belief and speech, even if they really seem like they want to. Just speak to them as though they are not, and make them spell it out if they are, because then it becomes much more apparent to everybody else.
Yeah.
Well, Mal, I mean, we could talk with Helen about this for hours and hours. There's so many fascinating topics, and we have to be mindful of this. So I think we're coming toward the end. And one thing, by the way, the last thing that Helen was saying about sort of finding like-minded people and so on, Mal and I have talked about that quite often in different contexts, like with schools and so on, like parents and everything. So I think it's such sound advice, right? Because otherwise people feel so isolated. I'm the only one. I'm the nail that sticks out that's going to get hammered, and they're terrified. There is strength in numbers. And, there are far more people who share your views potentially than you may see. So I think it's excellent, guidance that you're providing. So thank you for that. And for all the other stuff you said as well. I hope it gives some people heart and gives them some thought about strategies on how to combat what truly are toxic environments that are being created under the guise of, compassion and empathy and decolonization, etc. So so.
Can be very dehumanizing.
Yeah, for sure.
So Helen, yes, I'll echo everything that Oren just said, that I think you've given us and our listeners tons to think about and just a different perspective on how to approach these very real and very difficult situations that are arising more and more. So thanks for your wisdom and for your time with us today.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been good talking to you.
Great. So on that note, until next time, keep your eyes on the road and your hands upon the wheel.